Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Helen Rappaport and Susan Eisenhower.
First of all, let me say what an enormous pleasure it is to be back in Rancho Mirage. It's a delight to be part of this wonderful Writers' Festival, and what an enormous pleasure it is for me to talk to Helen Rappaport today. You know, Helen, we share a number of things in common, but the one thing that has come through so clearly as we've been talking since yesterday is our deep and abiding passion about Russian history. And I must say that I've read your books, and I have more pages turned down, and actually I use Post-it notes because I don't want the books to be defaced in any way, even with my own handwriting. But they are marvelous books about a really critical period in Russian history. In your book, Caught in the Revolution, which is a magnificent book, and I hope you'll tell us more about it, one of your outside observers said that you can never really know Russia.
No.
And I was wondering if you could say something about that. Is that what drew you to this field in the first place?
Absolutely. There's something about Russia that really sucked me in when I was a teenager. And of course then, growing up in the Cold War era, it seemed so far away, so remote, so impenetrable, so other to the West because, you know, it was locked off from us. But I think there was an immediate affinity I felt with Russia when I read the literature, and I've always loved the music. And whenever I write Russian subjects, all my Russian books, I've had Russian music playing in the background. And once it kind of sparked something in me as a young reader, age 14, 15, it's that kind of, it's become the great love of my life. It's become a huge passion. Russia never ceases to fascinate us and intrigue us because I don't think we can ever really quite get at the heart of Russia.
Well, there's a wonderful Russian proverb that says you cannot know Russia through your head, you have to know Russia through your heart.
Yeah.
Do you think that this passion of yours actually helped you understand what happened during those pivotal moments during the revolution?
I think you have to have an absolute instinct and sympathy, a kind of spiritual connection. And I don't know what mine is because I'm not Russian. People think, oh, you must have Russian blood. I don't have any Russian blood. I'm a real Viking, actually, looking at my ancestry. But yet Russians will say to me, "Oh, у вас русская душа." You have a Russian soul. I mean, if you believe in reincarnation, maybe I was a Russian in a previous existence. It's just something that the minute I hooked into, it really began reading Anton Chekhov. The minute I connected with Russia, visually, musically, I was there, I was connected to something very special that I can't really explain.
Well, I've actually had very much the same experience, and I had some experiences during the Cold War related to the visit of Nikita Khrushchev and other things like that, but it wasn't until my father went to Belgium as ambassador that I met a whole group of Russian emigres who had left Russia just after the February Revolution and had made their way to, of course, Paris and Brussels. And they were still drinking vodka, and they had paintings of the czars on all their walls.
Yeah.
And it was as if time had stood still. I was completely hooked. In your books, you have done a lot of writing about the Romanov family themselves. Of course, we remember that they were very much connected to European royalty. Queen Victoria, her ancestors or her offspring were everywhere. Tell us a little bit about the mystique around the last Tsar and his family.
Well, the wonderful thing about Nicholas and Alexandra, and I can at times be very detached and very critical about them, is it was that rare thing in the history of the European monarchy in that it was a love match. It really was a love match, where at a time when really historically and traditionally royal marriages were normally, planned and plotted, and the couples were steered in each other's direction, particularly for dynastic reasons. And what is fascinating about Nicholas and Alexandra, of course, is that Queen Victoria was absolutely horrified when she first heard that Nicholas and Alexandra were going to get engaged this was in 1894, because she had an absolute gut instinct that Russia, for her darling Aliki, she called Alexandra Aliki, she was one of her favorite granddaughters. She had this absolute overwhelming fear that it would be dangerous. And she said, I don't want her marrying into that unsafe throne. And she, of course, Queen Victoria was right. And can you imagine if she had lived to see the revolution destroy them and destroy so many of her descendants and relatives across Europe, whose monarchies fell as a result of the war. So there was this wonderful beginning to Nicholas and Alexandra that is intensely chocolate boxy, I guess you'd say. And of course, Robert Massey captured that back in 1966, I think, when his book was first published. And the extraordinary thing about Nicholas and Alexandra, that book, is it has never gone out of print in over nearly 60 years. So it says something about the public's fascination with that love story. It's a bit like the love story of Victoria and Albert, which is also a specialism of mine. And so, of course, you have immediately the happy couple adoring each other, loving each other, just wanting to be husband and wife and shut the world out, wanting to have a family. And then these 5 exquisite children are born. And the tragedy is compounded with every year, because first one daughter, then another daughter, then another daughter, and a 4th. Now there's enormous pressure on Alexandra to produce an heir, because in Russia it was the Salic law. She had to produce a male heir. So the scenario for tragedy, of course, is completed when finally, after 10 years of marriage, finally this longed-for boy, Alexei, is born, and oh, horror of horrors, he's a haemophiliac.
Yes, no, it's one of the great dramatic stories, and I think part of the reason, in addition to the love story, I think it becomes a more compelling story because of their tragic end.
Yeah.
Combined with the fact that in a weird way, it's kind of a metaphor for so much of Russian history anyway. Russia's a very emotional place. I keep talking to my colleagues in Washington, please stop trying to analyze this again with your head. This is an extremely emotional part of the world where pride and love and humiliation and all those emotions are felt much more deeply than they are in the West. And so I thought your story about the 4 daughters was absolutely exquisite, and I learned some things there. One of the things that was so sharply dramatic to me is how isolated that family was.
Yeah.
And maybe you could say more about that. It's almost as if they went into, as the Russians would say, internal exile. What was it about them as a family that took them so far away from where the aristocracy was and the thinking of the time?
Well, first and foremost, Alexandra, from day one, was absolutely hostile to the Russian aristocracy. She thought they were decadent, worldly, gossipy, insensitive. She disliked them. She did not want her beautiful, pure children tainted by associating with the aristocracy. So immediately, the 4 girls were brought up in a very closeted, careful way. She didn't immediately delegate to lots of governesses and nannies. She kept very strict control over the upbringing of her daughters and imposed a very Victorian set of values. So they had a very modest childhood. You know, they had very little pocket money. They were told to make their beds. They learnt to be tidy. They never sat idle without something in their hands. They're always knitting or sewing and doing useful things. So in many ways, Alexandra imposed the Victorian values. Her mother, Princess Alice, and her grandmother, Queen Victoria. But the real thing that changed everything in terms of the family's isolation was when Alexei was born, because within hours he started bleeding from the navel, and this was the fatal sign that he had the curse of the Coburgs, the Hesse disease, as it was called, which they had all been in denial about because, as some of you may know, haemophilia was transmitted unwittingly by Queen Victoria via the female line. And Alexandra had been praying and praying that this would not happen. She knew it was a possibility if she had a son. And when that boy is born and it turns out he's a haemophiliac, they close ranks immediately, because here's this precious boy, the heir to the throne. It could not be publicly perceived that the heir, the Tsarevich, was a cripple, that he had a potentially fatal disease. So it had to be kept an absolute state secret. And it was so secret that even Nicholas's mother and sisters weren't told. Nobody knew except Nicholas and Alexandra and the doctors.
Yeah, an extraordinary story. So if you take that with your other book, Caught by the Revolution, what you then see is this change of scene into Petrograd itself and the conditions that existed there during World War I and coming into the eve of the revolution. I was astonished by that book. First of all, Helen, what a brilliant idea to make it a book about what I would call intimate outsiders. In other words, people, Westerners who were living in Petrograd at the time, either through their embassies or through the businesses they represented. And of course, they cast a fascinating picture. I really learned something from this, even though I have spent my entire career reading about this part of the world. I did not realize that the February Revolution was as ghastly as it is depicted in this book. I think, wouldn't you all agree that the February Revolution, when the Tsar is overthrown, is seen as sort of the good revolution where the provisional government comes into power, and that the October Revolution, when the Bolsheviks, I should say the coup d'etat, when the Bolsheviks take over, is the bad thing. I couldn't believe the amount of brutality that existed in the February. Could you say something about the state of that society?
Unfortunately, I don't think they have my book. Book here.
I see. They
but
don't.
So I don't want
to confuse
confuse
you have to order it on
people.
Amazon.
But let me
It's
just
a page
explain,
turner.
because in many ways, Caught in the Revolution is complementary to my books on the Romanovs, because I wanted to tell the story of 1917, what happened when the Tsarism collapsed, from the point of view, a different point of view. We've got plenty of books that have told it from the Russian point of view. And of course, for 73 years, the Russians created their own mythology about the revolution, a very, a contrived Soviet point of view. I wanted to get myself on the other side of the street and put myself in the shoes of an American diplomat, or an American housewife, or a British ambassador's wife, or a British nurse. There were lots of British and Canadian nurses nursing in the hospitals during the war. I wanted to see how they viewed the revolution. And what is so interesting about all the foreign nationals who were in Petrograd in 1917 and from the previous autumn, because many of them were there for quite a long time, particularly the diplomats, was how they were all predicting downfall. They kept saying to each other, it's not, is it going to happen? If it happens, it's when. And from months and months, they're all saying, well, when are the revolutionaries going to come? When is it all going to come crashing down? What is the Tsar doing? Why isn't he listening to anyone? Why isn't he taking on board the constant begging, people begging him to bring in some political concessions to save the throne from coming down? So it's this horrible sense of inevitability about it.
It really is. Well, it's a very vivid account. I recommend that you all get to Amazon immediately and order your own copy. But the fact is that it fits in very, very nicely with all of the other work you've done on the royal family. Now we've had a big series of anniversaries here. We've had the anniversary, of course, of the start of World War I, and they're going to go like this until the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I comes. But in Russia, this takes on this coming year a more profound significance. Maybe you'd like to say
I'm sorry, I
something.
didn't quite respond to your question in explaining the difference between February and October. Now, from my point of view, having studied how the foreign nationals there reacted to events, I got very frustrated because in the media in Britain, and I don't know if it was the same here in the USA, there was this obsession that they were all going to cover October, which was the official Bolshevik takeover, the cynical, expected walkover, which it was. You know, Lenin and his cohorts all went in and took over very easily with very little resistance. What fascinated me was the explosion of grassroots popular revolt in February, which was very, very like France in 1789 when the French Revolution broke. In fact, it was very similar in that it was women marching on the streets in Petrograd in February demanding food because the food shortages were appalling, who triggered the riots and the protests, just as it was women marching on Versailles in 1789. February was the really visceral, violent explosion of anger against the old Tsarist system that was corrupt and moribund, and everyone had given up on ever making any concessions. And I don't think the West has paid enough attention to the power and the violence of February.
Well, it reminded me, I wrote a book myself about the period during the collapse of the Soviet Union, and there were a lot of the same phenomenon, people standing in line for 4 hours just to get a piece of bread. And actually, as a matter of fact, as we remember, Gorbachev instituted a set of reforms, including prohibition. And I didn't realize that the Tsar had instituted prohibition in Russia. No wonder there was a revolution. I mean,
it was very interesting. The one canny thing Nicholas did when war broke out in 1914, knowing his army was going to be a largely conscript peasant one, was immediately banned the sale of vodka to the lower ranks, because he knew damn well if they got laid hands on an alcohol, they would be unmanageable. So when the revolution broke in February, the first place the revolutionists went was raiding at the posh hotels and restaurants and going into their wine cellars and absolutely drinking themselves senseless.
yeah.
And in October, when they finally took the Winter Palace, and forget about John Reed, there was no storming of the Winter Palace. John Reed, sexed it up. But when they got into the Winter Palace, they headed down to the cellars, which was stuffed full of, vintage champagne going back to the reign of Catherine the Great and Tokay wines. And there was this enormous drinking binge going on.
They say that the palace absolutely reeked of
It
alcohol
stunk.
for weeks.
The whole city stunk of alcohol, because what then happened is the very puritanical Bolsheviks, who could see how dangerous this was, everyone was getting drunk. There would have been bloodlust. They go around, start smashing the wine up. And there are descriptions from my foreigners saying, seeing soldiers and revolutionaries lying in the gutters, trying to lick the booze up from the gutters where the bottles had been smashed.
Well, to put this into perspective, the conditions were so appalling for the working classes in that city that it was just like a complete and utter nervous breakdown in every possible way. And all this time, the royal family is
Under house arrest. Yeah.
But very clearly out of the picture, and again, still very isolated. There was one thing in that book that was rather stunning for those of you who sometimes worry about the fact that we need to be paying attention to these things, and often those who are doing very well in life don't pay much attention. But I couldn't believe that people were actually going to the opera the night that snipers were on the roof mowing down ordinary citizens. The aristocracy was completely out to lunch, weren't they?
Well, there was this weird sense of denial that this really was the big crash, the end of Tsarism. And I think part of the problem was because of the way Petrograd was laid out, there were pockets of violence and street fighting. And one reporter, described how, I think it was Arthur Ransom, the British reporter, how, you could be walking down a street where the people are shooting and fighting, turn a corner, and he said he saw a couple of old men scraping the snow up as though nothing had happened. So you did get the aristocracy going out to hear Shaliapin sing, going to the Mariinsky Ballet, to virtually in the thick of the revolution, trying to carry on as though nothing had happened.
Well, I was rather intrigued by one of your characters. Who knew that Ulysses S. Grant, was it his daughter or his granddaughter?
His granddaughter.
His granddaughter married a Russian count and was living in Petrograd during this revolution. Can you say something
Well,
about
Julia, I think she was later known as Julia Grant Cantacuzin-Speransky, to give her full name, met a Russian prince called Mikhail Cantacuzin-Speransky in Europe, and her aunt, I think it was Mrs. Potter Palmer, very influential doyenne of American society at the time, arranged this big Newport wedding. Can you just imagine it? I mean, I've been there, I've seen those houses on the lawn, all the bling, presents of Fabergé glass and all kinds of lavish gifts. They had this fantastic wedding. And then she went and lived with him in Russia and had a palace in Petrograd and an estate in Kiev. And she wrote a very good, interesting memoir about her time there. But the thing that amused me most was her American friends, of course, couldn't get their tongues around that long name. So they called her Princess Mike.
That's one way to keep track of her. So, no, but it's a very rich book, and there's so many extraordinary characters who run through these pages. And yet you keep, you have been continually drawn back to the Romanov family, and there's the Tsar kind of just gave up without any effort. I mean, he just gave it away.
I don't think it's quite like that. He was a man of great honor who really loved his country.
Yeah.
The patriot in him, you cannot take away from that, even if you think it's misguided. And he was put in a position when the revolution broke, and he was over Army HQ on the Eastern Front. A couple of representatives from the new provisional government came out and said, look, this is the situation. There is going to be a bloodbath if you do not abdicate. And Nicholas made a very conscious decision, first of all, that he was doing it for the sake of Russia, because they were worried about the levels of morale in the army, and that they had to pull the army together because it was all about keeping Russia in the war. The Allies were paranoid the moment Nicholas abdicated that, of course, Russia would leave the Eastern Front and allow the Germans to take all their troops to the Western Front. So he did it absolutely believing his act of sacrifice by abdicating would calm things down. But the other interesting thing he did immediately afterwards, he abdicated on behalf of his haemophiliac son. Because if he hadn't, Alexei would have become Tsar with a regent, but not Nicholas. Nicholas and Alexandra, as ex-emperor and empress, would have been obliged to go into exile and leave their precious boy.
Yeah.
The last thing in the world they wanted to do was leave Alexei because of the haemophilia, because they knew his life was always under threat. And also, privately, Nicholas did speak to the doctors and he said, look, tell me straight, what is his life expectancy? And at that time, long before they had factor, whatever it is, and all the medication for haemophilia, his life expectancy was probably 15 or 16 years old. So Nicholas made the decision to abdicate for himself and his son. And then, of course, the next one in line, Mikhail, the younger brother, Grand Duke Mikhail, said, no, thank you very much. He did not want the poison chalice of trying to save Russia and become Tsar.
You know, when you read these, your books together, especially with this, combined with the story about the situation in Petrograd, you wonder so many times if something hadn't happened, would things have turned out differently? Your portrait of Kerensky, who was the head of the provisional government, is is perfectly astonishing because he was not okay, as we say. And then you add to the fact that the Germans decided to sneak Lenin back into the country, and according to some reports, was actually being funded by the German government.
This is one of the big contentious things about Lenin's return and the Bolshevik takeover. There have traditionally been widespread accusations. We know that the Germans created the sealed train, put Lenin on a train to go back through wartime Germany, across and onto a ship across to Scandinavia. But there has been this constant accusation that he was directly funded by the Germans. The Germans certainly funded a lot of Bolshevik propaganda, which was very effective. The revolutionists were really leafleting all the factories, all the workers. But there's talk of thousands and thousands of gold marks being paid to the Bolsheviks and Lenin by the Germans, and it's still argued about because there is a lack of evidence.
Well, I'd say it's a pretty sensitive subject, too, but the net result of it, of course, brought this royal family out to Siberia and then to Yekaterinburg, where they met their end. But I guess it was the vividness of your writing that helped me really understand how it was inevitable that they were going to be killed. People had just lost their minds, actually. And do you have a perspective on this? Did the royal family ever think they were going to squeeze out of this tight situation? Did they know it was going to happen to them?
This is one question people always ask me. How aware were they? I think when you look at it from every possible angle and going on the evidence we have, I think Nicholas was quite expecting, and he'd been told, there were constant reassertions all the time they're in jail, that sooner or later Nicholas and probably Alexandra would be taken back to Moscow, put on trial. Nicholas, I think, expected that he would be sacrificed, that he would be executed. And he was entirely accepting of that. But you see, the thing in this story is that did anyone ever think for a moment all those beautiful children would be slaughtered? This is why it sticks in the consciousness. This is why people are so tormented by the big what if. Why did the children have to be killed? And the thing was, of course, from the Bolshevik point of view, it wasn't enough to annihilate Nicholas and Alexandra, because if they let the children go to either live in Russia, really the Romanovs just wanted to go and live in Crimea, right, and just disappear and live in Crimea, which they loved. If the children remained in Russia, they would have always been what Lenin called a living banner, i.e. a rallying point. And there were a lot of white and monarchist forces gathering in the south, still loyal to the old regime, who would have probably at some point tried to put someone back on the throne. We're not quite sure who. So that was the issue. But Lenin said that they had to all be killed, because even if they went abroad, they then in exile could have been a rallying point for a counter-revolution.
Yes, this is very true. Do you think that the children had any idea what was going to happen to them?
Well, I have a personal feeling that Olga, the eldest daughter, who by the time they were killed was 22, definitely had a terrible sense of foreboding. She had always been very melancholic and sensitive, and she, of all of them, was deeply traumatized by the hatred shown towards her parents after the revolution. It really broke her heart to see her father, the father she worshipped, so vilified. And towards the end, it was clear she wasn't eating. She had gone into a complete emotional retreat, had become very thin, very depressed. I think Olga sensed that they were doomed.
Right, so we've got really one of the most dramatic stories, honestly, of the 20th century, and we're coming up for a big anniversary now, which will be the 100th anniversary of the murder of this family. What do you think is going to happen in contemporary Russia around this issue?
Well, I've been saying for the last couple of years, don't get too preoccupied with the anniversary of the revolution. For Russians, it's about the anniversary of the murder of the Tsar, because ever since the collapse of communism, there's been a massive resurgence in sense of nationalism connected to the resurgence of Russian Orthodoxy, and with that, a veneration, almost a worship of the Imperial family, who of course are saints. If you go to Russia now, every church in Russia has an enormous icon of the Romanovs. So in July, in Ekaterinburg this year, there is going to be, I think, the most extraordinary act of breastbeating, penitence, reconciliation, you name it what you like, but I think the Russian people are going to really come together to commemorate their murdered imperial family, which is why I've written one final book, because the burning question for me has been all through my 10-year journey with the Romanovs. Why didn't they get them out? Why couldn't they save them? And it's the one question I get asked at almost every talk I do. You know, why didn't George V help them? And there's this sense people have that someone should have gone galloping in on White Charger, you know, and yanked them out of Siberia and saved their lives. And I have gone into the whole issue of the asylum, possible evacuation, and have unpicked the evidence and analyzed it, because I think there's a lot of misinformation and a lot of silly conspiracy theories too.
So why do you think there have been so many conspiracy theories that revolve around this particular incident?
Because people want to believe somehow by miracle one of those children survived. Because having to face the awfulness of the murder, I mean, of course, millions of children were slaughtered in Russia, the Revolution and Civil War. But it's the connection with the innocence of those children. Those 4 beautiful girls in their white dresses and their big picture hats. So lovely, so kind, so gentle, so devoted to their family. And that innocent boy. And people want somehow to think one of them got away, which is why the Anastasia myth won't die down. Even now I get people saying, did she get away? No, she didn't. They all died. And if there's one thing that happens this July, and I'm hoping and praying, is we can finally put the lid on the coffin and say, rest in peace. You know, may they rest in peace. And they will be honored and venerated in an enormous ceremony. The Metropolitan of Moscow is going there. There's even rumors that Putin will be there. And there will be pilgrims from all over Russia going into Ekaterinburg. The whole city will be jam-packed, which is why I booked my hotel 6 months ago.
Oh, good for you. Boy, that's forethought. I think it might help everybody here to understand a little bit more about Russian mysticism, because this would seem a completely counterintuitive activity to imagine that millions or hundreds of thousands of American pilgrims would go somewhere on an anniversary like this. Could you say something about the Russian psychology?
So deep in the psyche. So deep in the psyche. This sense of godliness and spirituality. And it is amazing. I was there in 2007 on the night they commemorate the murders. And there were pilgrims who were sleeping virtually by the roadside, who had walked, some of them hundreds of miles, carrying the icons in procession to commemorate the Romanovs and to pay their respects. It's something you can't really explain to anyone in the West. It's a depth of fundamental belief that people live by. And I think one lady summed it up for me. A lady, a babushka with a headscarf, you know, praying in the crowd outside the cathedral that night. And I said, why is your faith so important to you? I so full of admiration. And she just turned to me and she said, what else can we do? Our lives are so hard. Without our faith, we simply couldn't go on. And you know, Karl Marx was right. Religion in Russia is and always has been the opium of the people. And faith is what keeps these old ladies on their pitiful pensions going and going to church and standing through hours of ceremony. No seats in Russian churches, as you know.
That's absolutely true.
The devotion is astonishing, and it never died. The communists tried to destroy it. But I said, what did you do under the Soviet rule? We went underground, she said. We took our children in secret to have them baptized. And, you know, they couldn't destroy it over 73 years of Soviet Russia. And it just all came rising to the surface the minute communism fell.
No, it's very true, and I think this is one of the elements that's missing from most discussions about contemporary situations, say in Ukraine,
Yeah.
where the country is divided between Russian Orthodox in the East and Catholics and other Protestants in the West. This sort of fundamental, deep sense of religious adherence, which is a surprise to Westerners. But so sort of standing back and looking at this really transformational period in global history, what do you sort of take away from it at the end of the day? I mean, you've been so lucky to pursue your passion in this way. I've spent my time trying to make sure that the United States and the Russian Federation are not going to have a nuclear exchange here, since seriously, we're still on high alert with the Russian Federation. 6 minutes decision time to blow up the world 10 times. Still today, 6 minutes decision
I
time.
find that hard to
It's
accept.
unbelievable because, you know, after the Cold War was over, everybody said, well, phew, that's over. So we kept saying, those of us who worked in the arms control field, you know, what about high alert? Well, you know, if we got off of high alert, it would send the wrong message. Well, anyway, but it's still with us. So we have to be very careful in looking at the various situations that might spin this relationship out of control. And we have to worry as much about miscalculation, a mistake, as we do an intentional nuclear exchange. In any case, I mean, you have been having the fun, right? Because you have been delving into a completely different world at a different period of time. And what comes across in your book so magnificently are these personalities. You know, you just can't help but be completely wrung out at the end when, you know, you can see it's, you know what's going to happen in this story. And so what does it mean for you as a writer to have unearthed all of this and to feel actually this close relationship actually with your subjects?
I think for any historian, any amount of new research, new ideas, new evidence that you can come up with, however small it might seem, is pushing the envelope of our knowledge. And I'm very proud that through 3 books on the Romanovs and the Revolution book, I really do feel I've revealed some interesting aspects of late Imperial Russia. And I think for me, the ultimate gratification is that the Russians bought Four Sisters and translated it. They bought Caught in the Revolution and translated it. And they bought Race to Save the Romanovs, which is out in July, sight unseen. I hadn't even finished writing it. And I asked my Russian editor in Moscow, I said, I'm intensely thrilled that the Russians should want to read what me, a little, you know, an English writer, should say about their history. I said, why? What is it about my books? And they said, it's because Russian standards of historical writing are so poor, and they are so obsessed with conspiracy theories. And they're as far as Romanovs go, there are some particularly unpleasant aspects. There is an obsession in Russia that the Romanovs, the murder of the Romanovs was the end game of a big Jewish banker conspiracy, Jacob Schiff and the New York bankers. And they've got this obsession that all the Bolsheviks were Jews. And there is a nasty, nasty anti-Semitic element to a lot of writing in Russia. Even now, there were 2 books, new books on the Romanov murders published in Russia. I read about 10 pages and threw them out because they were so nastily anti-Semitic. They had a clear agenda right from the start. I didn't want to touch them. And that's why Exmo said they wanted my perspective because, and that's a thrill for me to feel that I, as a British writer, can give them a more honest perspective on their own history.
I think it also indicates the complexity of the environment in Russia today, that they would be allowed to buy your book, that they wouldn't hesitate to do
being
it.
a bestseller.
Being a bestseller, sight
Caught in the
unseen,
Revolution
et cetera.
has been in Dom Knigi on the Nevsky Prospect, piled high. It's been a great success. And what's so wonderful is Russians have told me, I had no idea about this. Of course, they were never told what the Westerners in Petrograd thought of their revolution, even after the collapse of communism. They said it was wonderful to see a completely non-political point of view, because they've been so force-fed through, 70 years on an official view.
Well, and also there is a fascination about the city of St. Petersburg, Petrograd. Let's see, it was St. Petersburg,
Petrograd, then
Leningrad, then St. Petersburg again. And there's a fascination about that because so much today of the ruling elite comes from that city, including Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, who comes from Leningrad, as it was, born after the siege of Leningrad during World War II. And so even people who grew up in that environment didn't know the history of their city.
But it's a wonderful city. I mean, if you go there, it has an intensely mournful grandeur that I've never sensed anywhere. Don't you feel it?
Absolutely.
The powerful sense of tragedy, loss, suffering. It's just seeps into the stonework. You feel it. And then when you're walking down the Nevsky or along the Neva, along the riverbank, and you hear the bells, those glorious Russian bells. I think the bells are in my psyche. Maybe I should have them played at my funeral. I just love them. The timbre is wonderful.
Well, Helen, I have to say that probably one of the greatest thrills of my life, in addition to helping the Department of Energy evaluate U.S.-funded non-proliferation programs in Russia, which took me out to the Ural Mountains, where I went to one of their top-secret nuclear weapons facilities. Oh my gosh, that was something that won't happen again for me or for anybody else in the West. But on that same trip I had, or a little bit later, I had an opportunity to go to Tsarskoye Selo and to get inside of that palace that had not been open to Westerners yet, because it was still half of the palace that Nicholas and Alexandra spent their time under house arrest.
It's the palace they retreated to, because they never used the Winter Palace once Alexei was born. They wanted to keep out of the public eye. So this is like the Versailles
of Russia. You know, it's out in the countryside, and during the war, the Germans occupied those heights. But your book actually put an emotional patina for me out of going through those rooms, and I had the extraordinary experience, by permission of the director of Tsarskoye Selo Museums, to get into the basement and up into the attic and into the rooms where this family lived, which were completely closed to the public and to, frankly, the director. I don't know quite how I got in there, but I think he was saying to the authorities something about our common victory during World War II, and there are times when my association with Dwight Eisenhower is really helpful. But it was the most moving thing, and the person who took me through the rooms was weeping when we got to the Tsarevich's room. This is, look at, we
because
can't
of its ordinariness.
Because of its ordinariness, the fact that the building was falling down,
Yeah.
the fact that the little boy had been murdered, and this was a man in military uniform.
And it was actually the thing that horrified people when they did see it quite soon after the revolution. They're expecting, Imperial Russian grandeur, which you get in the Winter Palace. You go to Tsarskoye Selo, to the Alexandra Palace, and it's very bourgeois. It's domestic. It's a family home.
Right.
In Alexandra's lilac boudoir, where she and the girls would sit, Nicholas would go in the evenings and read the family books, read out loud Sherlock Holmes stories or, detective novels. The girls would sit and sew and knit, and it was just like any Victorian or Edwardian family. And that, I think, people can connect with. You see, people thought they were so imperial and grand up here, and they did look like that in their ceremonial robes. But effectively, they moved away from imperial grandeur in 1903 with the last great big state costume ball. And thereafter, they lived a very private, domestic, uneventful life, except when Alexei had near-fatal attacks of bleeding.
But it was a total shock because they opened that palace, didn't they, after the revolution? People went in and they kept wondering, when are all of the, the beautiful, priceless pieces of this and that, when are we going to see this grandeur?
And the Tsar was too ordinary for them.
Yeah. What an extraordinary story. So can you say a little bit about the project that you're going to be unveiling here? about saving
about
this.
Race to Save the Romanovs. As I mentioned, throughout my writing life, when I meet readers, they constantly say, was it all King George V's fault? You know, why did he let the family down? Because, of course, the British initially, very briefly, offered a temporary asylum, and it was temporary. It was going to be for the duration of the war, because the Romanovs didn't want to feel they were going to leave Russia forever, and the Brits didn't want them all settling and being a drain on British government funds. So people kept asking me this, and I thought, hang on a minute, it's not simply a matter of one man, one king saying, yes, get them out, let's rescue them. You know, you've got to get a family of 7 people out of the heartland of revolutionary Russia, along railway lines controlled by Red Guards who would have stopped the train and probably lynched them. And there were so many factors in play at the time. And there is this chain of buck passing that went on around the royal families of Europe. You know, they had a lot of royal relatives who should have all come and helped as well. And the Allied governments passing the buck. Fundamentally, Nicholas and Alexandra were an enormous political hot potato that no one wanted to handle in 1917. So I have gone back to the evidence, and I have searched for new evidence. I've researched in 8 languages for new material to try and unpick what really happened behind the scenes, because I feel it's the last question that needs to be answered.
Well, I know I can speak for all of you in saying that, Helen, this has been a riveting conversation. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.